What is up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Limited Resources. This is episode number 729. My name is Marshall. I'm one of your Limited Resources, and joining me on the line all the way from Denver, Colorado, it's Luis Scott-Vargas. Luis, you ready to jump into the show this week?
Let's do it.
I know you got the kids home starting tomorrow, so this is our time to shine before your house is overran.
Yeah, when we were scheduling, I was like, let's do it. Let's do it on Wednesday. Let's not do it on Thursday.
Like 4 days before Christmas too, man. It must be a high energy environment. But and you know, with that in mind, we decided we'd bring out the big guns here for this episode as well. We've got Sierkovitz back on the show. Sierko, coming to us from Cornwall.
Yes. I think that if I achieve one thing by visiting this podcast, it is teaching Marshall where I live. And
that is not Wales.
And now I hear that you're watching Cornish-based the TV shows, and,
I am.
And soon you're going to buy a Cornish kilt, the yellow and black, by the way, the colors.
Okay,
so,
yeah. I'll start shopping for those right after we record the show. We've got two really awesome topics to talk about with Sierkovitz based on articles that he's written. Of course, those articles will be in the show notes as well, so that you can read up on all the details. But we're going to kind of hit the high points of them and talk about some of the things that Sierkovitz took away from some questions that he had about limited and draft in general. These are big picture questions, and they're really important to kind of take stock of as we continue forward in our draft journeys. Before we get into that, let's mention our patrons on Patreon, patreon.com/limited resources. Thank you so much once again to everybody who supports us over there. It's been another great year for us here on LR, and it is really made possible ultimately by our patrons, and we really appreciate each and every one of you. If you'd like to become a patron of the show, you can go to the website I mentioned. It's also in the show notes, and you'll get a thank you card and a sticker in the mail as our way of saying thanks, no matter what level you sign up for, and you get some cool perks as you go up the chain. Again, thank you very much to each and every person who supports us on Patreon. It does mean the world. We also have a great sponsor, Ultimate Guard. If you need supplies, like maybe, let's say you're making a cube. I don't know, maybe you're making a cube at home and you need a box to put it in and a bunch of nice sleeves and all that kind of stuff. Ultimate Guard is the place to go. So you can head over to ultimateguard.com and you can check out all their products. You can also get them at your local game store, your favorite online retailer. And I'm telling you, these are the best ones you can get on the market. There are other good companies. This isn't, look, there's some good products out there, but when you do side-by-side comparisons, when you really look at the best sleeves, boxes, ways to haul your cards around and stuff, Ultimate Guard has you covered. They are fantastic products, really top-notch stuff, and we're really happy to have them as a sponsor. So if you end up getting some holiday money, or if you want to get something for your favorite Magic playing friend, definitely Ultimate Guard is a great place to go. Luis and I are particularly fond of the katana sleeves as a example. Okay. We've got a Patreon question of the week. This is kind of a short one, but this one says, so maybe this question is just way too old to get asked at this point, which is kind of why I liked it. But I'm going to throw it out there anyway. When you changed the theme song from Quiet Little Voices to the current song, what was the impetus for the change? Was it legal, pure personal choice, desire to have something original that wasn't related to something else? Longtime listener, first time caller, Andy Swan. Andy, thank you for the question. That makes you a very, very long time caller, because that was a really long time ago that I did that. And the answer is legal, mainly, because so that's a song that I really, really like. And I thought it made for a really nice intro song as well. But of course, you can't just go using any old song you find, even if they happen to be, a band that you really like. But I did have a licensing deal set up with a company that they had worked with, where you could pick a song and you could use it. And so I was doing that, but the license expired, and then they no longer were offering it anymore. So I wasn't allowed to use the song anymore as the answer to it. And I thought, you know what? I don't want to have to keep going through this, to do it this way over and over again. So I actually hired a musician to do the song that is now the intro for the show. So thanks for the question, Andy, and thanks for listening for such a long time, because that was quite a while ago. Okay, let's do a crack-a-pack. We always like to do one of these with Sierko on, especially just to get an idea of where he finds the format. I think at this point, a lot of times Luis and I's opinions are pretty well sussed out, but Sierkovitz sometimes throws us some curveballs. So our first card out is Captivating Cave. which is the one that taps for colorless or filters for any color, or you can pay 4 tap and sack it to put 2+1/+1 counters on a creature at sorcery speed. You a captivating cave guy, Sirki?
Moderately, but probably too much also. I think that this is one of the most overplayed cards in the format. I looked at some data and I noticed that people who play fewer caves in their decks win more. You should put more basics, especially in the aggressive
I'm
decks.
not a fan of the cave, so that tracks for me.
I mean, I occasionally will like splash it if I have like a really powerful splash card that that I want to have relatively free in my deck. So but not. I don't want to play it as a default, especially that it's not as good as Crystal Grotto or something. Lack of scry is painful.
Idol of the Deep King. This one's fallen a bit flat. Where are you at on it?
This is also a card that is misplayed often. I see people playing it in decks that don't have any artifacts to craft it with, and it looks pretty pathetic as a 3-mana shock.
What about Marauding Brinefang? That's the blue land cycler.
Well, yeah, I love Marauding Brinefang, but not in a pick one situation.
Can I upgrade you to an Oaken Siren?
Well, now we're talking. Now, this is a card I want to have in my deck, preferably blue-white or blue-red aggressive. But let's see what's there apart from it. But it's a very good card.
Child of the Volcano.
Next.
Seismic Monstrosaur. That's the red land cycler.
I prefer the blue one.
Okay. All right. What about Ray of Ruin?
Ray of Ruin, I wanted at pick 7 or something like that.
Yeah, man. This feels like a relic of the past at this point. The 5-mana sorcery speed, kill anything. You used to be pretty comfortable putting the first one of those in your deck, and now they just feel more and more like really a liability.
Funny. Going back to cons, I've been drafting a decent amount of that, and 5-mana instant, give a creature -4/-4, which just doesn't even kill all the creatures in the format, is not a card you cut from your deck all that often, honestly.
No, I've been throttling a lot. Yeah.
We had this card for 2 mana, and it was not so good in this format recently. It was black as a cost, and the black was pretty poor in that particular set. But still, this is how it has fallen down.
This is where we've gone. Frilled Caveworm, certainly not on the level of these other blue cards. Walk with the Ancestors. How do you feel about that one?
Specific card that will be played somewhere, but not a pick one.
All right, that moves us to. Wait, are these the? Man, I can never tell. Whatever. Miner's Guidewing.
You skipped Altec Cloudguard, which I thought was a bit of an omission.
Where did I skip?
Altec Cloudguard.
Oh my God. You're right. And that's like a really great card too. How about Altec Cloudguard?
I would take it over the Siren.
Yes.
I'm really glad you noticed that, because that's like the best comment.
I was waiting for it.
I was telling Sirko before we started that I don't look at the whole Crack-A-Pack because I like just looking at the cards one by one.
Uh-huh.
So I didn't see that because I don't have it open. But yes, that is currently the pick.
Yeah, we kind of buried the lead there a little bit. All right, well, how about Miner's Guidewing? Yeah, you're with me, Luis.
But yeah.
No, you're with me. Sorry.
The lead got buried, is a good way to put it.
By the people at Limited Resources. Miner's Guidewing?
It's a great card, and it in some decks it's better than the Altec Cloudguard, but I would still take Altec Cloudguard over it. You can't unring that
bell. I already know about the Cloudguard. So.
Yeah. Sorry, I went back now. What about Earthshaker Dreadmaw at Uncommon?
Nice pick 6.
Okay, all right. What about Sinuous Benthesaur?
Sierkovitz, do you know what a pick 6 is?
That's when you intercept the pass and you score a touchdown.
How did he know that?
Impressive.
Dude, I watch a lot of.
He's dusting off his shoulders right now.
Man, that was impressive, dude.
I watched Ravens with whoever they played who they played actually Jacksonville on Monday.
Wow.
Even.
Look, I'm just saying, I know a lot of American Magic players who don't know what that is. So
totally. That's incredible. Sinuous Benthesaur?
I love that card, but that's a very bad placed love. I think it's a great card, and there are decks that will definitely want it, and you want to get them late and go into that particular type of deck. But I think it's the best cave payoff in this format in my books.
Okay. So we have the Old Tech Cloud Guard. We've also got the very nice Oaken Siren. Now we've got Zoetic Glyph.
Bam!
Just windmill everything else off the table.
Don't think too much about it. I think that there's so few cards in this format that I would pick over Zoetic Glyph.
Okay, yeah. The mythic uncommon for the set or whatever. The rare's pretty good one, though. It's actually the same cost as Zoetic Glyph. It's Akal-Pakal, first among equals.
Great Teletubby name. But I would pick Zoetic Glyph over it, even though Akal-Pakal is really good, but it's just not as good as Zoetic Glyph is, in my opinion.
What do you think, Luis? Glyphing it up? You gonna Akal-Pakal it up?
They're both very similar. I would probably take Akal-Pakal because I haven't only gotten to play with it once, but I do think that if I was day 2 of Arena Open, I'd probably just take the Zoetic Glyph. It just makes a 5/4 haste that draws a card when it dies and some mana to cast that card. The Akal-Pakal needs a little bit more work. Though both are going to increase your win rate a lot, but when you cast them.
Yeah, for sure. Interesting that we're passing a lot of good blue here. I know we downplay that, like that isn't really going to make the decision. That sounds
like their problem, not like your problem.
Yeah, that's true. It is interesting that the pack 2 is likely to be pretty light. I mean, somebody's going to take Old Tech Cloud Guard, somebody's going to take Akal-Pakal, and somebody's going to take Oaken Siren, most likely. Miner's Guidewing. Like, I'd be a little worried about pack 2 if I was in blue-white, let's say. But
okay, next level, the Marshal pick the Bentazor and draft 5 colors caves, and no one is going to compete with you.
Oh, wow. I never thought of that. Yeah, I wish I could draft caves. Is it just real quick, has it just been terrible, Sierko, like archetypically speaking?
I think that if you draft the mere control that has some caves, maybe some splash for the cave-ins, you can make a good deck, but you really are at the mercy of what is going to be open in the packs. If you don't get like the good black cards, if you don't get your Tithing Blades, if you don't get your Death Cap the Death something marionettes, you will be in a world of trouble. And that's still doesn't guarantee that you're going to win games, because you still might not be just good enough in stabilizing for this format.
Yeah. That leads us to our our topic here about stabilizing the board, which has become increasingly more difficult over the years, as it turns out. So, Sierko, you wrote an article called "Finding Plans in a Draft Format Using Data," and
I'm in for catchy titles, am I not?
I like it. I mean, this makes it easy to search, right? Like when you have a body of work like the one that you have that's growing and growing and growing. It can be difficult if it's too cute, to find like, well, I want to find the article where he talked about this, and then it's some like, pick sixes in limited or whatever. But this article it sort of starts off about speed, right? Kind of you asking some questions about speed and what does that actually mean, when we say, hey, this is a fast format.
Yeah, because the term speed, I think, is just thrown around kind of willy-nilly, and people mean different things. I don't know, the longer I listen to the discussion about speeds of the format, the more I think about the discussions about definition of what tempo is in Magic, where everyone has their own definition.
Oh, you mean the best discussions?
Yeah, and how to get uncommons on a big tournament. But I think that in order to have like a more structured debate about it, it's good to look at what components are of the speed. And 17 lane data gives you the numbers of how long the games are, but it won't tell you why the games are short and why the games are long. Mm-hmm. And there can be different formats with the same speed, but with a completely different characteristics. And to go back into Amonkhet times, this was a fast format, but it was a fast format because everyone was attacking each other, but they were just passing each other like two ships in the night. And it's still a fast format. There are some formats, and I think Phyrexia OB1 was a good example of that, where the formats were fast because of the disproportion in deck quality. And you can see that from the 17 lens data, where bunch of like lots of people that were opponents of 17 lens users were playing those. They tried to go for the toxic wins because it's fun, and 17 lens user were going for gruel oil because it's winning. Different interests, different priorities, but because those toxic decks were very badly matched against the gruel decks, games were fast because gruel just steamrolled over those, and also because people were competing so heavily for those toxic payoffs that they ended up with a very mediocre version of their deck, and they never self-corrected. They never stopped drafting the toxic decks because they wanted to get poison kills, basically. And there are formats like LCI, in my opinion, is where the games start snowballing, and that's why people win quickly, because once you accrue some advantage, next turn you're going to accrue slightly more advantage, and next turn you're going to accrue slightly more advantage, and it just ends up with a complete snowball, and there's no way of stabilizing it very well.
And so the tools aren't there to undo that advantage.
Exactly. And these are three completely different ways why format can be fast, and they're very different, and you cannot just compare a fast format like Amonkhet with a fast format like LCI with a fast format like very weirdly Pyrexia LB1 was.
So one of the things that you mentioned here with regards to snowballing mana, I'm assuming you mean advantage on the board, but how does that actually manifest? Is it just that I've spent more mana than you have?
It's partially this, but it's also person who has, I hate that word. I hate that they made it into a mechanic, but person who has initiative in the game, the person who starts first, will force opponents to make bad decisions because they are attacking first. They are attacking with open mana into someone who should be tapped out, and that will generate problems for that person. And if the format is built like this, that will frequently mean that the person on the play is going to have a big advantage because I'm playing a 2/2, you're playing a 2/2. I'm attacking you with a 2/2, you block. I have a 1 mana combat trick, I play another creature. Now I have 2 creatures, you have 0.
Yeah.
That's already the first snowball. It doesn't even require spending more mana. But of course, in that kind of format, not spending as much mana as their opponent did is, of course, a recipe for disaster as well, because they are going to, cards right now are quite high on how much mana you pay and what value you get. So if you spend 1 extra mana every turn, you're going to get so much more value that obviously your board state is going to be very difficult to deal with.
Okay. And how does that, how big of a deal is that? Is there a way for us to quantify that? Having spent more mana earlier or at any point?
As you might know, what a setup question. There is, I did this calculation, and the data that I'm going to show is not for LCI, but it is for the Lord of the Rings set, which was also pretty snowbally, which was also when you started amassing and your opponent was 1 step behind in the amassing race, you obviously got a big advantage. When you played your Rally at the Hornburg on turn 2 and you attacked for 2 already, you were so much ahead. But the graph, and I am afraid I cannot see the video, so I don't know if the graph is on it.
Yeah, Jeff will do it.
Okay.
Producer Jeff, trust him.
Okay, so the graph, the graph that shows that we basically can see that if you're at mana parity, so the middle row, if you are spending equally to your opponent and you're starting the game, for the first 7 turns, you're going to have an roughly 1.52% advantage in your win rate. And the longer the game lasts, that advantage is going to slowly disappear and actually turn into disadvantage, because if you manage to survive past turn 7,
you're down a card.
You're down a card, and that makes a big difference. But if you are not in mana parity, even on turn 2, if your opponent outspent you by 1 mana by that time, at the end of the turn 2 cycle, so both of the players finish turn 2, you already have roughly 5 percentage point lower win rate than your opponent.
Okay. And to be clear, that just means they had a 1-drop and you didn't have a 1-drop?
Yeah, well, if by the end of turn 2 they played a 1-drop and you played nothing, that's the situation. Or if you both play 2 drops but they played a 1-drop, that's the situation, yeah.
5% for that.
Yeah.
And no wonder we take one drop so highly now.
Yeah.
My goodness.
If it's inverse, it's going to be roughly 4% in your advantage. And this sort of the difference of 1 mana spending is diminishing as the time progresses. So if you outspend your opponent by 1 mana by turn 7, it's only going to be like 3% advantage or something like that.
Okay.
But it's still there. It's interesting that even if you outspend your opponent by 1 mana on turn 10, you still are roughly on parity. So that extra card is worth 1 mana across 10 turns. This is the price of 1 extra card, basically. And of course, if you outspend your opponent grossly, that's going to be just skyrocketing. So just 2 mana.
But that's important here, right? Because you were saying that these things snowball. So like, give us an example of that. Of, let's say I really outspend you.
Well, you really outspend me. If you play 1-drop, 2-drop, and the opponent does nothing for the first 2 turns, 14% extra advantage. If you spend 3 mana more by the end of turn 3 cycle, 25% higher win rate. If you underspend by 3 mana by the turn 3, you get like 17% lower win rate. So it's going pretty quickly. Like these are much more expensive than taking a mulligan at some stage, and this should be something that you should consider while taking a mulligan. Mulligan is roughly 17% hit. So if you keep a hand where you will not play anything till turn 3 because you don't want to mulligan, maybe it's worth it, because if they play 1-drop, 2-drop, you have worse chance
than the mulligan would have cost you. Wow.
Of course, that comes into possibility of drawing that 2-drop and other considerations. But looking at your hand, you should be taking that into account.
But this really does illustrate the snowball nature of what you're talking about, where if you get behind, it gets bad very, very quickly. And this is very early in the game. I mean, I think that for old school players, they may think like, well, I missed my 2-drop. I didn't have a 1. Like, I don't have that many 1s. I can orchestrate something to come back, and maybe you can, but boy, those are things are going to have to go pretty well for you, from there. Like those are made like very difficult to recover from taking a hit like that, game after game after game after game. Like your win rate is going to suffer if you're not focusing on that early part of the game.
Yeah, it's that sinking feeling when the opponent starts with the Miner's Guidewing, and then on turn 2 they play this not such a great card, but the 1-2 that puts a counter on something, and you're like, well, I can kill the 2-2 now. The 1-2 will become a 2-3. I wasted the card on that. Where is the advantage? And it's like, it's a really sinking feeling that you're getting in this format when you were in the slower deck, and maybe you had the 1/1 Death Toucher, but the flyer would just go over that and won't care.
Okay. So that's interesting and certainly useful information, right? Just, to differentiate between what a fast format actually means, like not just the idea that there's cheap aggressive creatures and that's what people do in the format, but actually breaking it down to, well, is this a format where the creatures don't block well, therefore everybody gets to just sort of attack freely so the game ends quickly, or something like this that you're describing where it's like, well, advantages tend to build on themselves and there's not a lot of ways for people to unravel an advantage. There's not a lot of 3-drops that undo a 1-drop and a 2-drop from your opponent.
That's exactly the situation. Although there are some atrocious 3-drops in LCI in terms of the power level, but it also, if the format is constructed like that, it requires you to go full speed all the time. And if you are required to go full speed all the time, it loses a bit of a gameplay depth, because you don't have those moments where, I'm going to wait for a turn, see how the situation developed. I did notice it by playing Khans of Tarkir, that in Khans you have time for doing that kind of stuff. You can plan your actions, you can construct a strategy, while in LCI you need to go full speed all the way every single turn. You need to do something. If you stop doing things, you're just going to be overrun very quickly. And I think that the balance of the speed and strategy is important, because they promote different skills that you have as a limited player. So I think that LCI will definitely promote people who are drafting very well, because they will be able to build those decks that play out naturally, and the curve will naturally lead them to the conclusion that they want. While Cans will promote players who are good in strategical kind of plan, implementation of the plan, thinking, waiting, knowing when to pause, when to attack, break the tempo, not rush things, for example. This is going to be important for those players. And I think that players who prefer this kind of gameplay had years now of not being satisfied maybe with limited as much as they could have been, because their gameplay is just not being promoted. It's just very difficult to do it. Sam Black still manages somehow, but that's an exception rather than a rule.
Yeah, it's interesting because whenever I think about a fast format, I traditionally don't think of it in terms of just pure aggression. I just think about it, and by the way, I think about my baseline for a format is this way now. Like, I don't think about this as an exception to just fast formats, but my thinking is you have to be doing things all the time. They have to matter. They have to be board impacting ideally, and you do not there's no breaks. Like, it starts on turn 1 and you want to build a deck that has the capability of doing something that matters every turn of the game from turn 1 to 6 or something, ideally. And once you start to step away from those things is when you start to go off the path of what wins in, modern era limited.
Yeah, it is to an extent true, but the sheer duration of the game is also an important factor, because if you want to play controlling decks, they almost by definition will not be able to win by turn 5, 6.
Yes.
It will just happen very rarely because they're just not built for that. Right. Even in the modern environment, if you build a control deck, you need answers more than threats, and those answers will take a larger chunk of your deck than the decks that are aggressive. And because of that, you will just not be able to overwhelm the opponent at the same time. And if the game naturally finishes so quickly for the aggressive decks, then sometimes you will not have time to deploy all your answers, and the threats will be just too much for you to cope with. And because of that, control decks will not reach the state when they are favored frequently enough for them to be successful. And we can see that in this format.
Well, and it feels like in most formats now.
My experience is yes, and I think last format when the control deck could have been actually good, I think was maybe Kamigawa Neon Dynasty.
Maybe. Luis, what is your take on, control decks and their viability in the current era?
Yeah, I haven't really felt like you should be drafting control decks most of the time. I do feel that like blue-black and green-black in this format are control decks. Mm-hmm. But for basically all the reasons Sierkovitz said, I think that trying to control the game is just not the best strategy, because control decks famously struggle with 1-drops, particularly 1-drop flyers, just because there's almost nothing that trades efficiently for them. Imagine a Miner's Guidewing. Use any spell that kills that. It's going to cost more mana, and they're going to get the value on the way out.
Yep.
And now this is why I've been really beating the drum of Mineshaft Spider or Echo of Dusk as like ways to like deal with their thing without attacking them. But for the most part, I don't think that playing the controlling strategy is good, particularly in this format. But even all these formats, the creatures are so good, they hit so hard. It used to be, and I've gotten a taste of this with cons, where like you could get hit, you could let them play their creature and hit you and play another creature, and you wouldn't just lose if you didn't have a play. And that's just not where we're at anymore. I mean, cards aren't like that. And I'm not saying every format's going to be super fast, but I don't really think they're going to heavily walk back the power level of cards in general. And I just, I had games and cons where I cast Rakshasa's Secret. They discard 2 cards. And there's just no way that you could do that in this format.
Yeah. You would be so punished for effectively taking that turn off. The way that I've adapted, because I like to draft those type of, longer game decks when I can, is that, I mean, like you said, there are archetypes within formats that do lend themselves to that. The blue-white deck, the failed tap deck, but turned into a pretty decent control deck, for example, and then the ones that you mentioned in this set. So they do exist. This is a broad strokes discussion, of course, but the way that I've adapted is, before I felt like you could get away with kind of just not doing that much in the early game, maybe setting up your mana or drawing some cards or, something like that. And then you could start playing these more powerful things that would help stabilize you. And those days are long gone. So I don't try that approach anymore. Instead, I try to go, blow for blow with them. It's just that the cards I'm deploying are defensive cards rather, hopefully overstatted or, whatever, but board affecting defensive cards. And that doesn't often come together. There's not that many cards like that fit that description, but sometimes they do exist, and you can, they've been fond of printing 2 mana 3/3 defenders lately, right? And like those are good blockers. Those are things that are, they can be difficult. They can be a real speed bump for an aggressive deck with a good curve out to get over. And, those types of cards, can help. But even then, you're bridging a gap. Like those aren't the ideal. It's not a removal spell. It's not something that just cleanly kills your opponent's creature and leaves you with no board state. So yeah, I found it very difficult to draft these. And, I'm thinking Sierkovitz in like the bigger picture, this feels like an artifact of just the way that the sets are designed. I call them like spreadsheet designs because it feels like they're picking boxes, right? They're like, okay, we need a 3 mana common flyer. Let's make it a 2/2 and give it the set mechanic. Okay, there you go. And, we need a 1 mana white common creature. What can we do with it? That kind of thing. And it feels like a lot, a good chunk of the cards in the set are kind of set in stone. Oh, here's the cheap common red removal spell. Oh, here's the expensive red common removal spell, right? We see these patterns over and over again of these kind of blocks that get filled in. I don't know if that's the reason or if there's been the push towards the more effective, cheap cards, but for whatever reason, it does feel like it's an artifact of like the way that these sets are designed.
Yeah, but I think that, yes, I understand that the design is now based on certain blueprint stencil or whatever. Mm-hmm. I think that if I can use this as a forum, because hopefully some design people do listen to LR because of it being LR, I think that it's time to maybe shift the design strategy just ever so slightly. And it doesn't need to be revolutionary. It's just that for a long time, 4-drops at common have been really bad, and 1-drops and 2-drops were really pushed. Why not just slightly change that dynamic? Maybe make the cheap creatures a bit more vanilla and the more expensive creatures give them additional abilities. Because right now, playing a 4-drop is just a suicidal strategy where you count on playing that 4-drop and it's just going to be blown up by removal, and you're so far behind at that time. And especially that it's going to be killed by a removal that costs 2 mana probably, and they still can play a 2-drop on top of everything. This is the thing that Lewis was talking about, the 3/4 spider in this format, which is a great way of blocking those aggressive blue-red and blue-white decks. But you play it on turn 4, and you just have to pray they don't have Petrify. And if they have a Petrify, that's game. And they will have Petrify frequently. Mm-hmm. And, you play your 3/3 blue creature with Pseudo Defender, the one when Artifact comes into play, it can attack.
Yeah.
As a roadblock. And then they just put Zoetic Glyph on their Oaken Siren and completely ignore you, Yeah. And then still manage to block you even if you attack back. And if you kill the Siren, they get a 3-drop for free.
So I think that part of it is, it used to be that if you wanted to get card advantage, you would put spells in your deck. You'd put divinations or some other spell that would give you a 2-for-1. There just weren't as many 2-for-1s. Now, almost all the creatures have, not almost all, but a lot of the creatures have built-in 2-for-1s. I make a treasure. I explore when I die. I draw a card on some of the cantrip creatures, whatever. And now you can play, if not an aggressive deck, an assertive mid-range deck where, I think like Dinos is a bit like that, even though, unsurprisingly, the Dinos decks that win more are the ones that have more 2-drops. The Dinos deck isn't just a pure aggro deck. It's playing a curve of creatures, but it generates card advantage so easily, just like all the aggressive decks. Like, I'm going to attack and get a treasure off, my mine cart or whatever. I've got, the staunch stalwart that draws me a pirate or an artifact. Like, you just get all this card advantage. It used to be that if you wanted to play an aggressive deck, you would put a bunch of aggressive creatures in your deck, some removal, and your card advantage in quotes was that they didn't get to cast all their cards before they died.
You stranded cards in their hand. Yeah.
Right. And the control decks had the advantage in games where they could deal with threats because they had actual card advantage. And then by the middle to the end of the game, they're up 3, 4, maybe more cards on their opponent, and you can kind of win that way. There's just no reason to build a deck like that anymore or put card draw spells for the most part in your deck. Chart of Course is like an exception because it's really efficient. The rate on that one is actually good enough. It turns out you can, bump the rate on cards and they become good enough. But now I'll just play this aggressive deck or this mid-range deck, and I'm just going to get plenty of cards regardless. And then if I run out of cards, I'll sack a cave or whatever. There's just not a big reason to try to play a card advantage strategy when every strategy kind of gets that built in effectively for free, I would say.
Is this just an effect of the thing that gets brought up all the time when we talk about this, not only in limited, but in bigger picture, which is just power creep?
Well, I mean, yes and no. Like, yes, it certainly does have something to do with power creep in that cards are getting a bit more powerful. But I think there's been a pretty heavy push to not make it so that, or to make it so people don't really run out of plays to make. And it all is a design decision. Like it's not to the point where you couldn't make a set where control was good, or you couldn't make a set where having like the 1-drops were bad and the 4-drops were good. You could clearly make all those if you wanted to, but it is just a little bit trickier figuring out like what you want that to look like.
Because it does feel like a trade-off, because I will say that I would be very reluctant to give that up. I enjoy that aspect of modern design, that it kind of does feel like you always have stuff to do. It's kind of rare that you're just like land, go, land, go, land, go. You know, it's like there's some common land cycle that lets you pay 5 mana to get a card back out of it. There's, a creature with an activated ability. There's cards in your hand because your creatures all drew you cards or whatever. And I do like that. Like that it would be tough for me to say, well, look, if you want this other thing, you got to give this up. I may make the same decision that they've made if that was ever on the table, and say, well, no, I'd prefer to have games where there's just a lot more action happening in all times, and you reduce that frustration of just sort of getting to the end of the game and being completely at the mercy of the top of your library.
Yeah, but I mean, even by shifting the value somewhere higher up the mana curve, you're going to achieve sort of similar effect. It's just like, I can give you a very anecdotal example from half an hour ago when I was playing Wilds of Eldraine bot draft, because I decided that I want to refresh myself on that particularly lovely format. I drafted the green, well, sort of band control. It's mainly green-blue. And green-blue is particularly suffering in the new design. And Simic has been the worst archetype in 25 sets in a row. Maybe exaggerating there, but I have a Goose, I have Graph Triplets, I have a bunch of card draw, hatching plans 2 times into the Fey Court, bunch of interaction, putting things like curse rolls on everything, and I still end up games with 2 cards in my hand, and opponent with their aggro also 2 cards in the hands, because I had to spend so much resources to deal with their threats. And yes, in the end, the Graph Triplets do the job, but not every deck will be fortunate enough to have the biggest bomb in the format. So it's a problem that those control decks just can't efficiently deal with the threats. One card that I loved as a design, that you can have your 2-drops, but you can also have your value, was the thing from Dominaria United. In a perfect format, this would be great. There was a 2-drop, and for 1 and a blue, it had a kicker, look at top 3 cards, draw 1 of them, or something like that. Mm-hmm. And it's a great card because it gives you the card advantage, but you have to pay extra for that card advantage. It can be played aggressively as a 2-drop if you need to. But the card was not good because just the format was too much value was already at the 2-drop, and this one looked pathetic compared to those.
Yeah, it's really tough. Go ahead, Luis.
Yeah, I don't think it has to be a choice of hey, do we have to give up all these anti-flood cards basically in order to make it so aggro is not too powerful and control is a little better. I don't think it's quite that easy, but I do think that the tendencies of the way they design cards push this in this direction. You can adjust things you can make slightly fewer 1-drops. You can make the 1-drops be a little less good. You can make the 3 and 4 drops better if you want. I'm leery of saying make the removal spells better, because then the aggro decks will just put those cards in their deck and it will be good.
Yeah, no kidding.
So that I don't think is like the ideal solution. But I think there's a lot. There's some knobs that they could push if they wanted to. They don't necessarily want to do that, though.
Yeah, I think the one of the cruxes for me are the 1-drops, because it has felt over the past, I don't know, 3 or 4 years or whatever, that they've made a concerted effort to make 1-drops viable and limited, where there was many years where they just weren't. It would be very strange to have a 1-drop creature that you'd actually want to play that was, not a rare or something. And now, it's one of the first places we look. It's just like, and when we read a 1-drop, we'll be like, it doesn't seem that great, but I bet you we'll be first picking it, or I bet you it'll make the cut every time, or whatever. And more often than not, that has been the case. But when, the mana system is a little awkward, right? Like the difference between spending 1 mana and 2 mana is massive. And right now, most of the 1-drop creatures feel roughly on par with a 2. Like they're a little less, but I mean, they feel like they're over 3/4 of the way there, like that. Some of them are better than the 2s that you get. And but if you turn that notch down just a little bit too low, then they're unplayable. Like, and then they don't see play. And then we're all just skipping turn 1, which just feels kind of weird and limited when it's like creature based, and we should kind of be starting on turn 1 in some ways. And so I do find it to be a very, very difficult design space, but to me, it feels like that's one of the hallmarks of this era, which is that the 1-drops are not only playable, they're good. Like they end up being the cards that make the decision. And Sierkovitz, you laid out why, with that graph that you were talking about before. I mean, it is a decided advantage if you can play, again, a 1-drop that actually matters, which they do now. Like you wouldn't get bonus points before. I would love to see this type of graph on some sets that were out before Arena was out, where like if people were foolish enough to put a 1-mana creature in their deck and they played it on turn 1, how it would play out for their win rate. Because my guess is that it would have actually made it less.
You play 1-drops in Tarkir if you are white. Occasionally, I guess.
But Tarkir's actually, it's been really illustrative getting to play cons again, because it shows you a lot of what has changed. And it's been 10 years, right? It's been a little, like about 10 years. I think it was 2014. So 9 years, I guess, though we're at the end of 2023. And cons has like the 1-drops are terrible. Like, yes, there's some playable ones, like maybe like Mardu Hateblade, and Monastery Swiftspear are kind of hold up, but like you have like the Firebrand Cavalry, right? The 1-mana 1/1 you can pay like 4 to pump it.
Yeah.
And these cards are generally really bad. The removal is really bad. The game has very few ways to get card advantage. So everyone that you do matters a lot. The games are slower. All this stuff that's different now. But you look back and you're thinking, okay, what lessons can we take from this? How does this impact current design? And I think they've turned the knob a little too far on the 1-drops being good, where I think you could just turn it down a little bit.
Yeah. Just to give you the just game duration data from last couple of years. Dominaria United was the slowest format in the last 2 years, and every single set released in this year, so March of the Machines, Lord of the Rings, WoW, and LCI, all of them have been at least 0.7 turns faster than Dominaria United,
which is a lot, right?
It is a lot.
Yeah.
Just to give you the full picture there, none of the sets that were released before this year were faster by 0.7 than Dominaria United. So every set that was released this year was faster than any other of the main sets released in the last 2 years.
Yeah. So, I mean, that really stands out.
This is like super outlier in terms of how bad it is. And also 3 of those sets had insane on the play advantage, LCI, MUM, and 1. And actually, people might think that 1 was so fast and it's going to be the biggest offender, but no, actually, the on the play advantage was highest in March of the Machine. despite it being slightly slower. But I think that maybe something to do with the poison decks that people drafted as opponents of 17 lands users. But you're not going to tell me that Midnight Hunt or Kaldheim or Crimson Vow were the sets where you didn't have anything to do later in the game, because you did. You always had something to do in those sets, but they were slightly slower, and that gives space. Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, slightly slower, but you still had so much to do every single time because there was Channel, there was a bunch of mana sinks, there was plenty of cards that you could use, and still the set was slow enough that allowed for existence of controlling archetypes.
Yeah, and that's really the key. What other takeaways from your article did you have for us, Sierko, before we go to the other article we want to talk about?
Well, one thing is that looking at exact win rates when you are playing those LCI decks. This is like specific for the LCI, but if you look at win rates, depending on which turn the game finished, you get some quite nice conclusions, and I think handsomely looking table graph. If I might say so about my own graph creation.
Do it.
So basically what you see is that there are four different types of decks. Fourth one is rubbish. Fourth one is rubbish. But you have three really aggressive decks, and that's Boros, Izzet, and to some extent Gruul. Mm-hmm. And you can see that Boros and Boros and Izzet decks, they win roughly 68-70% of their games if the game ends on turn 4, 5, or 6. Mm-hmm. That's very high win rate. And they actually managed to win quite a large percentage of those games that early, which shows that they are not only good in when the game ends early, but they're also capable of managing that.
Making that happen,
Yeah, exactly. And then on turn 7, both of those decks, they drop to 63% win rate, which is still amazing. Turn 8, if the game ends on turn 8, they win 58% of the games that end on turn 8. And then it's a big drop-off. From turn 9 onwards, it goes to 53%, then it goes to 49%, and then it sort of stays like mid to low 40% win rate if the game lasts longer than 10 turns. Mm-hmm. So both Boros and Izzet don't have a staying power in the games. They will just, basically win if they manage to get the opponent down to very low and maybe finish with some direct damage spell, because there is no ways of passing that stage. There's no tectonic hazard like there was in one that you can, even when you were behind, you start losing the game, but you still had 2 creatures, you play tectonic hazard, you attack for 5 and you finish the game. And it's very similar with Gruul. Only Gruul wins roughly 63% of those early games that finish early between turn 7. And then it starts dropping, but it doesn't drop as low as it does in case of Boros and Izzet. So it's slightly worse to finish early, but it's slightly better in staying a bit longer in the game. So that's a strength. By the way, maybe people don't know, but according to 17 Lands data, for the last 2-3 weeks, Gruul is actually the highest win rate archetype in the format. And I think that people are still in the mentality that Jeskai colors are the best, but actually good old Gruul did not deteriorate across the format, has the same exact win rate as it had in week 1.
Aren't those statements you made the same thing? Isn't the reason Gruul's winning is because people are playing? No. That's of course they're fighting it out for those cards.
Yeah, exactly. But just something to think about.
Yeah.
Dinos! Then there's Azorius, which is a slightly slower deck. It cannot have those kind of super explosive starts. It does still win quite a lot in the early games, like 57% on turn 4, 60% on turn 5, 61% on turn 6. But then it sort of stays. Even on turn 10, it still wins like 56% of the games, which means that Azorius is aggressive but has a higher staying power in the game, and it's not as fast as the other ones. So it has some tools to enable those longer games. And even you go to turn 14, 12, it still has 54% win rate. So it never drops below 50%. So when you're drafting Azorius, you should keep that in mind, that you don't need to be super fast. You can play a bit slower game. There's probably 2 types of Azorius games also. which, technically you can check in the Archetype Explorer tool on 17 Lens that you talked about last week. There is this more controlling version, there is this more aggressive version, but it operates nicely in this kind of mid-range territory, capable of being aggressive, but also capable to staying a bit longer. And actually, Selesnya is very similar to Gruul in its format, in its win rates. Doesn't win as well early, but it also can win till late, not as good as Azorius does. And then you have two decks that are actually very bad in the games that finish early.
Horrible.
And that's Dimir and Golgari. The Dimir peaks at 39% win rate on in the games that end on turn 5. So it really struggles. But if a Dimir deck goes to turn 10, if it goes to turn 13, you're approaching 60% win rate territory. So it's a good control deck. It is winning vast majority of the games that end late. Of course, the question is, can those decks stay late? And the same with Golgari. Golgari also wins around 60% of the games that end on turn 12. And, in the sweet spot between turns 10 and 14, if you manage to end the game, you're going to be highly advantaged if you're playing a Golgari deck. But if you are having a quick game, probably you lost because it just doesn't have any tools to win so early. So this is the whole question is, can you... From this graph, you can see the plan. Boros, they want to win early. That's the plan. Dimir and Golgari, they want to make the game last longer. And that's their plan. So you can see the plan. But the important thing is, can you actually successfully implement the plan? And when you look at the next graph that shows the percentage of games that end on a particular turn, you can see that, first of all, Izzet will end 14% of its game on turn 6. Roughly cumulative 23% of the games that Izzet plays will end in that 4 to 6 turn territory. And remember, they win 70% of those. So that's 70% of the quarter of the games are going to be won very early. And then still 36% of the games end on turn 7, 8 when it still has a decent win rate. And then very few games will go to turn 13, 14, 15, 16. We're talking about like single-digit percentages. So Izzet can implement its plan pretty well.
About half the time it'll be in that thick part of the range.
Exactly. And, after that, they still win 40% of the games that are not on the plan, which is, not terrible. And actually, when you look at the Golgari deck, only 10% of the games will end in this atrocious territory of turns 4 to 6 when they lose most of the games. So that's not terrible. But then you add 25% of the games that end on turn 7, 8. Then you add 28% of the games that end on turn 9, 10. And when it comes to this really good territory, there's just not enough of those games that are lasting that long. So probably... just eyeballing it right now, but probably like 35% of the games go past turn 10. And for this deck to be great, 50% of the games should go to that territory.
Yeah. So that's tough.
This is a small difference. This is like slowing down this game by half a turn, and Dimir would have been one of the best archetypes. If a couple of those 1-drops were a bit less pushed, if a couple of those 2-drops were a bit less evasive, or maybe if a couple of those control kind of tools in the Dimir toolbox would be slightly more pushed. And all of a sudden, this game would have... If they would reprint Vampire Spawn, I tell you that probably if the Vampire Spawn was reprinted in this format, control decks would have been so much better. But of course, then what would happen is that the aggressive colors would start drafting them and killing them in the face. But the Vampire Spawn on the other would have been good because black clearly is not good in aggressive decks in this format. So it would be purely a defensive creature, which would be great for a kind of controlling strategy because that gives you that half a turn.
Louis, go ahead.
It doesn't. Yeah, it just doesn't. And you can see from that prevalence graph, if you think about those numbers, you will see that it just misses this half a turn extra for control decks to be able to stabilize and to be able to take over the game.
Luis, before we go to the other one, do you think we'll see these changes or a slow format again?
I don't want to say no, because it is possible. Again, even using this kind of philosophy, you can tweak the design and push things a little bit slower. Because some of the numbers Sierko's talking about here, if the format's a half a turn slower, this deck might have been good, sort of thing. Half a turn is actually a pretty big amount. Is my intuition that a half a turn slower is a pretty large amount. But you could push it that way. Like, even just imagine LCI. Imagine if, first of all, you maybe straight up just cut like 2 of the 1-drops, and then you added or tweaked some of the 3s and 4s to make them a little stronger. This could easily slow down the format overall. But I think that, will we see a really slow format again? Probably not. I think the cards don't lend themselves to that, really. Will we see a format that is slower than this last crop? Yeah, I think so. Also, the folks at R&D do listen to feedback. LCI, I think, were meaningfully less popular than some of the other formats. And I don't think speed's the only thing that has to do with it, but it's certainly one of the talking points. So I could definitely see that being something that they keep in mind and they change.
Like, just to depict it with numbers, half a turn is the difference between the average duration of the game of Wilds of Eldraine and Brothers War. That's half a turn difference between those two formats. It's just Brothers War. Rarely have I played a format where bunch of 2-drops could make so much action in the game. You just played things, unearthed them, and you never run out of stuff. And still, the games were reasonably long for some controlling decks to be good.
Great article. Again, the link will be in the show notes, and there's some really great takeaways, not just in the big picture stuff that we talked about here, but also about how you draft and how you implement a game plan. Another one, though, that you did, Sierko, was about trophy rate.
Yeah.
What was your question that you wanted to answer there?
So it was not the question. It was an observation. So I basically struggled for years, and I'm literally saying years, watching the leaderboard on 17 lands. Why do some players have same win rate but a different trophy rate? And it was an observation that I've seen.
Easy. I can answer it right now. It's luck. Move on.
Wow, how much time did he just save you, Sierkovitz?
I know. I found that being incurious about the world is a really good way to save time.
Yeah. Wow.
Well, I guess that's it then.
Yeah. Sorry about that profession.
The link is still in the show notes. The link is still in the show notes.
Yeah.
And I was always like at the edge of it. I think that like bunch of years ago, I had a discussion with Ari Lax about it by accident. Before I was like doing anything in terms of content, before I was here, I just like said, well, if you try to spike a tournament, you just probably want to force an archetype and hope for the best. And people that will do it will probably have a higher trophy rate compared to their win rate, because they will go for it and they will gamble. And if the gamble pays off, they have an excellent deck. But if the gamble doesn't pay off, they probably 0-3. So, and I've been toying with this idea, but never completely formulating it. And then I invited as my guest a famous Magic the Gathering arena grinder, Pasta Pirate, a person who has the most games played in 17 lands ever. And they play 10 drafts. 10 drafts a day. And what I notice is that they have not an amazing win rate in general. It's around 50%, 51%. But what I notice is that they have actually quite a high trophy rate. And I formulated this, like when I was preparing for the episode, I took his own personal data and I started analyzing it. And before I touched the data, I said, probably they force a lot. And then I looked at the data, and out of 1,600 games that they played in Wilds of Eldraine. Think about it, 1,600 games in Wilds of Eldraine.
That's incredible.
300 drafts in that format. 1,000 of those games were with black-red rats. And then that was like an amazing example of someone who is forcing a lot. And he does it like unabashedly and is proud of that, which is fine. But this gave me like a good point to start thinking about this from this perspective.
That's like 2/3. That's like 60-ish% of all of the drafts.
Yeah.
And if we were to do it completely distributed among all of the archetypes, that would have been 10.
If you would distribute it across
there's 10 archetypes, right?
Yeah. He would have 160 games, and he had 1,000. So overrepresented.
Now we know that some archetypes fall off, and so it's a little higher. But like that is astonishing. Like that has to be forcing, right?
I looked at this data, and there was like every time there is the Ratter first picked every time, and that was clearly a strategy from his side. He liked playing
first picked is one thing, but like hanging on for the ride that's incredible.
And this is the other thing, that 95% of the time when it was first picked, it was also in the deck. So there was like, come hell fury, it's going to be this.
That is amazing.
It will end up with lots of 03s, but it will also end up with lots of 7Xs. And then I started formulating this idea more precisely, because now I have the knowledge that, okay, he's got a higher trophy rate than the win rate would suggest, because you can calculate what should be your trophy rate from the win rate by combinatorics, and basically calculating how often should you go 03, how often you should go 1-3 if you have your average win rate.
Okay.
And then I sort of started speculating that, okay, so if people deviate from that average that you would expect by calculating it, in one way or the other, that would mean something. So if they have higher trophy rate, then it would come up from the just pure odds of having your average win rate. That means that probably they force a bit more than they should. But if they have too low trophy rate, that means that they probably dirtle too much, and they don't fix on the proper deck.
Or take some risk.
Exactly. No, decide, because if you pick the best card for 42 picks, you're going to end up with a 5-color amalgam that will just not work. But you have all the best picks that I picked. I always pick the best card. So sometimes you just need to say, no, I'm not going to pick the best card. I'm going to pick a card that will define my lane. And some people just don't do that early enough. And then I plotted like the leaderboard of Arena. And you can see that there's this nice curve when you have your win rate to trophy rate. You can see Jean-Emmanuel Deprat there as a sort of outlier at a modest 80% win rate, 60% trophy rate, quite above everyone else. That's mainly from Cube as well, and that's in best of 3. The 80% win rate is not accessible in best of 1 across thousands of games. So rest assured, Luis, you don't need to stress. You don't need 80% best of 1 win rate to match that.
I'm not even trying to match it. No, JED's our world champion for a reason.
Yeah.
But then I sort of started speculating what would happen if you would. How can you use this information? How can you use this information to gain the actionable advice? And generally, I came from the good old Ben Stark article, Drafting the Hard Way, where Ben is postulating the approach of, staying more open, delaying the decision, finding the right lane, and being rewarded. And as much as this is a great strategy, this is not the only strategy. And I think that the article is still probably like the best piece of limited content that both in terms of like its longevity and its impact on others, because if you see how many tribute articles to that one are, that already is a good sign that this thing was something on. But then there are concepts from other players like Ham and Ryan Sachs, where you should draft with preferences. And then you basically weigh the quality of the card, not by the card itself, but you take into account the context. And I know that Ben already updated his concept of drafting the hard way, that you should also take into account the what potentially can you open in the future and adjust for that. So if you see a busted blue card in the a busted blue card and a slightly a slightly worse black card, but black is really good in that format, maybe you should think about picking the black card because you can get rewarded by being in a better color and stuff like that. But if you know your win rate and if you know your trophy rate, you can position yourselves on this graph. So you can basically point the finger where you are. And if you are one of those people who trophy more than they probably should based on their win rate, maybe you should think, I should stick to my first pick a bit less. Maybe I should consider, especially in pick 1, pack 2, I think that this is a key moment when some people will just go, oh, I'll pick the thing that is pretty decent, that fits with my first pick. And some people will go like, no, this is not exactly on plan, but this is a much stronger card. And maybe if you are above that line on the graph, maybe you should consider sometimes picking something that is not exactly go with your first pick, but is a stronger card in vacuum. But if you're below, then you should start focusing on, okay, should I pick this 5th color card in my 5th pick, or should I maybe start thinking about solidifying a certain lane and starting to draft an actual deck rather than the amalgam of cards?
Go ahead.
Yeah, and then that's why it's sort of like a mathematical way to try to optimize between pure forcing, drafting with preferences, and drafting the hard way, and finding where you are in there, and then using this as a sort of self-diagnosis tool on where I am and where should I direct my efforts in improving how I draft.
Because Luis, one of the things that I think you're really, really good at, it comes out in your cube drafts on your YouTube channel quite often now as well. You know, you'll usually refer to it as specking. You know, you're like, oh, I might spec on this card over here. And I think that dovetails off of what Sirko said about people who are, you know, a little hesitant to just say, okay, I am these colors. I'm going to solidify myself and commit to this is my lane now. But I think that on top of that, there's room. I think that people that don't spec enough probably are ones who are too conservative during the draft, not just staying too open, but also, you know, okay, there's this reasonably solid red card, but there's a gold card early and I may not be in these 2 colors, but it's got a really high upside, you know, or I can take this card. Yes, I'm giving up something for it, but if I can pick up the other half of the combo or the other pieces of the puzzle here, then make this card work. I can have this tremendous upside. And I see you do that all the time, Luis.
Yeah, it's a little different in Cube because Cube more has like cards that are 0s or like 10s. Like if you take a flash early, then it's either going to be in your sideboard or be one of the top 3 cards in your deck. It's almost never in between, you know. Or if you take Zuranor because you already have Fast Spawn, now Crucible becomes like a 10, a 9 in your deck, something that you would take over almost everything else. But if you don't end up finding that Crucible, that Zuranor might not make the cut. In limited like LCI, it's a little bit different because you're not speccing on cards with such high value differences based on what other cards you see. Or other specific cards you see. It's more like, okay, do I take the black card here, even though I have, you know, red and green cards because this is like a pretty strong 5th pick black card, or should I take a worse red or green card? You have to find that balance. I think in modern limited formats, it's actually pushed a little towards being a little bit more aggressive in speccing because you're not going to run short on playables. And when you do run, quote, short on playables, but not really, it's because your last couple of cards, they go from being like C's to C minuses. They don't really go from being like, you know, C's to D's. Whereas like, I mean, to go back to the cons example, because I felt this pretty strongly there. I had a sealed deck that was a couple of cards short, and like the last couple of cards were really bad that I had to play. Yeah. Like I just didn't have the fixing. So I'm like, well,
off color morph or whatever.
I guess I'm playing 5 mana 2/8 or whatever. And that sort of thing. So it can be really tricky. I would say the average person probably takes less shots. They take less speculative picks just because from watching people draft for, you know, 20 years, people get pretty quickly into, okay, I guess I'm blue-white when it's like 5 picks in and you have 3 white cards and 2 blue cards. It's like, you know, if you see a good red card, you could be white-red or blue-red. Like you don't have to do that.
Yeah. I think the gold cards thing comes up as well, particularly gold uncommons. Like, I've seen it a lot of times where you'll get a third or fourth pick gold uncommon that touches one of the colors of a card that you've already taken, but it isn't in your primary pair. You've got 3 picks in, you've got, 2 red cards and a blue, and you find like a blue-white gold card or something like that. But it ends up being one that can be very, very good. Another example would be pack 1, pick 1. Solid red removal spell versus gold card that, if you end up in those colors, is amazing, right? I think that I've been more likely. I still usually will play the solid lane if it's a color that, has like, say, 2 colors that go well, 2 other colors that go well with it, for example. But if it's a color, like let's say the solid card is a color that there's really only one other color that I want to pair with it, I may just take the gold card and take a shot, because like you said, you just don't get that punished if you don't end up playing it. And if you do, it ends up being like a top 5 card in your deck or whatever, where old version of me would have just always taken the more solid pick, because I'm like, I want to stay open. I want to, I don't want to take these early risks that put me into these positions where I could just be throwing away a bunch of picks. But, I'm closer to that now. I'm not reckless with it, but like I'm much more willing to say, I'm just going to take a shot. I accept up front that there's a good chance that this card doesn't make the cut.
Well, it also kind of depends what your goals are. do you want a trophy more? Because I think in some ways the way to trophy more is to take more shots if you care about literally going 3-0 or 7-2.
Yeah. Well, what is the middle? Where should we be aiming? I guess you should be
aiming with the correct amount of speculation, the correct risk versus reward.
I know that part. I meant, I don't know what that correct number is.
In the middle of my curve. That's in the middle of my curve, and I think that there is a good reason for that, because yes, trophying a lot may be as good when you're a content creator and you get like value from writing trophy on something, but you're hemorrhaging gems through that, because of course going 7-0 and 0-3 is netting you fewer gems than going 6-3 and 4-3. So that's one thing. If you are not fixing your lanes early enough, then on the other hand, you run into a trap that you're actually lowering your win rate, because your decks are weaker than they could have been had you solidify your lane at the appropriate time. So every turn that you delay the decision to decide on what deck are you going to draft is going to cost you like small percentages of wins in those games. And because of that, if you start solidifying into your draft at the right time, your probably win rate is going to go like up by 1-2%, and your trophy rate is going to go up by 3-4%. So you're going to be benefiting from that quite a lot. There's just one, because obviously this is a very simplistic look at the problem, when I'm only telling you that it's all depending on whether you decide on the plan super early or too late. There is also another possibility for the people that are below the line, that they pick the right lane, but they pick the wrong colors. So this is a trap of drafting the hard way. When I saw it in someone streaming, and they said, you know what? I tried to draft open and I draft the hard way. It was in WoW, I think. In Phyrexia OB1. And I always end up with blue decks. And I said, yeah, of course you end up with the blue decks. Blue is always open. So of course you end up with blue if you always find the open lane. That's the problem with that.
Yeah. So there's a slider there that you can adjust as well.
Exactly. Okay. That maybe the decision of which plan to take was good from the perspective of, this is an open lane, but the preference was not there. So the lack of preference is causing lower win rate, because you apply open lane, same number of points, but clearly Gru lane is much more valuable than the Dimir open lane in that particular format.
That kind of goes to show that if you want to really be the best version of the limited player you want to be, it does take some metagame research as well. Yeah. That's not to say you can't figure this out. Like someone like, Ham, who drafts a ton and probably doesn't spend a lot of time looking at 17 lands, is my guess. Like
he is on it, so
No, I know he records it. I'm not saying he doesn't know about it or use it, but I'm saying like he probably tries to figure out a lot himself, and he ends up with his preferences based on that. If you're a less talented drafter than Ham or Ben Stark or whatever, looking at what the different colors and different color pairs and different cards win as a whole can help you set those preferences. Because like you said, it's not just, do I find the open lane? you need to find the best open lane.
Yes.
And there are some formats, like, for example, Lord of the Rings, where our team concluded it was fine to first pick a black card if you knew face up the two people in front of you were first picking black cards. Like, you just wouldn't draft a non-black card to start if there was a black card as an option. And, I'm not all saying that all of that is completely correct, but it just shows that knowing the metagame, the broad scheme of things about that is really important as well.
Yeah. Okay. This is a personality test to finish here. Sierko and Luis, would you rather have a higher trophy rate or a higher win rate at the end of like a given format? More trophies or a bigger percentage?
Higher win rate.
I would go for higher win rate. Unfortunately, I'm one of those people who are not by much, but slightly above the curve. So I tend to force too much. But part of it is, I think, because if I open like an interesting rare, I'm just going to force it because I want to play it. That's it.
Yeah. I mean, and that's okay too, right? I mean, that's a decision that you're making. And Luis and I are similar too, especially when it comes to like arena drafts in the middle of a format, right? Like I'm willing to just try it out, and I'm willing to throw away a lot of equity to just see if something will work, or just to try it for fun, or to try to do a challenge or whatever. But of course that's different than if it's like day 2 in an arena open or whatever, where I'm not really touching, cards like that. But I don't treat every arena draft as if it were day 2 of an arena open. I don't just screw around where I just don't care at all. I do care, but at the same time, yeah, if there's a sweet build around that I haven't got a chance to do yet, or if I know that there's a chance that, I could try it, I'll do it. I'm game. But I'm with you guys. I want the percentage. Okay, let's call it a show there, fellas. This is great stuff, Sierkovitz. You're really killing it, man. These articles, I'll put both links in the show notes. Where can people find your work these days? Find you, get a hold of you, tell you that your graphs are cool?
On Twitter, I'm Sierkovitz. I did start my own Discord. So,
you did? Okay.
Yeah, it's free for everyone. So I think that the link of it is somewhere in my Twitter description or...
Okay. So if I put your Twitter, your x.com profile.
My XCOM has most of the links to my stuff, and then you can just find the rest of it. I still record my magic numbers. I crossed the magical barrier of 100 episodes with actually, wow. I had a guest for my 100th episode, and it was the Ben Sack, not the rip-off version from New Zealand, but the original the Ben Sack from Australia.
Wow.
Yeah, you actually still owe us our finder's fee for lending him to you as a guest.
Yeah, he owes us. That's how this works. Well, that's great, Sierkovitz. Thanks again for taking the time during the holiday season of dog walks and boggy, hikes that you do out there. And we appreciate you taking the time.
No problem. It's always a pleasure to be with you, Marshall, in the studio.
And that's going to do it for this episode of the show. If you want to find us on social media, I'm Marshall_LR and Luis is LSV. Again, we'll have Sierkovitz's info in the show notes, the 2 articles that we referenced today, as well as his Twitter profile as well, so you can find the links to his Discord and all of his other stuff. If you want to find everything related to the podcast, it's lrcast.com. We want to say thank you once again to Ultimate Guard and our patrons for supporting us. We really appreciate it. With that, we'll see you next week.
So I wanted to mount a little defense of cons because I feel like I've seen a lot of people basically say like, hey, this format's not all it's cracked up to be. Why do people think this format's good?
This is why I don't go on Twitter anymore, man.
Yes. Well, obviously you're very smart for that. But I think that cons has a couple things going that are kind of interesting that I wanted to kind of talk through. We of course talked about them a little bit on the show so far, but just to kind of put it all in one place. And of course, and thanks to TBS as well. He had a long Twitter thread about this, and I found I agreed with a lot of his points. So cons has a couple things which feel odd, which I don't think are necessarily bad, but I could totally see why you would not like if you were coming from the last couple of years of Limited. One is that the cards are much worse. And this, I think, is a point against cons. I don't think this is like a selling point of cons. Cards just tended to be worse back then. And I think limited has gotten better as the average cards have gotten better. I'm not saying everything has to be super pushed, but I think it's more fun when you don't have to play a bunch of bad cards, and cons had way too many bad cards. Like there's just no reason to have that high a percentage. Like you could have half a pack left and it's like, wow, I don't want to put any of these cards in my deck. But that's not to say that the percentage that we have today of being good is right either. I think that having slightly fewer good cards these days would actually be good, because I think it's probably less fun to cut from 29 cards to 23 than to cut from 24, 25 to 23. Mm-hmm. So especially if you're always getting over 23 playables in a draft, not having to cut a ton more actually I think is upside. Cons has very much fewer sources of card advantage, like we covered in the show, and that I think has some upsides, but is very dissonant. It's very jarring when you come back from like, wow, it's turn 7. My hand is basically empty, and I'm just hoping to top deck something. Where'd all the cards go? What happened? And cons has that effect. Like if you get 2 for 1 in cons, you feel it. If you get 2 for 1 twice, like the game is very difficult for you to win. And again, that's neither good nor bad. There's upsides to both, but I think that playing that style of game can be pretty fun and interesting, and I don't think it's bad for cons to have that as part of its aspect. Cons did have, I think, worse mana than I would think that I say is ideal. I think that the mana for cons is just, for a 3-color set, I do think it is a little bit worse than I would like choose for it to be. And that's fine. That is definitely, I think, a valid complaint about cons, that you go into it and it's like, oh, you're supposed to draft 3 colors, but if you didn't first pick the lands, or you didn't see enough of the lands, you end up in a spot where you either have to hope to not get mana screwed or play worse cards than your opponent. Neither of those are fun. I've definitely had some cons games that ended like that. So again, that's another point against cons, which I admit. I do think that I don't like this
segment so far, by the way, Luis.
We're getting there. I think the slower gameplay is an upside. I think right now we're at too fast. I think that limited would be better if games were a little bit slower. I don't mean a lot slower. I don't mean 3 turns slower, but a little bit slower. And especially, and this has to do with both speed and power level, they're very intertwined. In Modern Limited, if they have 2 creatures in play and then you play a creature and then they kill your creature, you just always lose that game. Sierkovitz was saying 5% was how much win equity you lost if they had a 1-drop and you didn't.
Right.
I enjoyed going back to games where you could let one of their creatures hit you for a turn and not use removal on it. That is just no longer an option these days. And I think one of the biggest parts about cons, which I don't think is unfair that people didn't like, but definitely was a selling point for me, is the whole morph game, knowing which morphs they are, when to flip them, when not. I had a lot of fun. I still had a lot of fun doing that. And that's something that best of 3 brings out the best of, and best of 1 does not. Like, you can still play around Defeat Weapon Master from your Jeskai opponent in a best of 1 game, and I have. But when you're playing against a 5-color deck, you just kind of give up on trying to figure out what their morph could be, because they could have so many different ones.
Yeah.
Whereas if it was a best of 3 match, you're like, well, I've seen these 4 morphs. This one doesn't make sense. This one I can't beat. Let's concentrate on the other 2. That's good gameplay. Like that is fun. And I think that is something that is very cool and, it is a point in favor of cons. I think overall it's a very different kind of game. And I don't even want to say it's just better, because I don't believe that's accurate. But cons is slower. You have to fight more for card advantage. Creatures do have higher toughness, which leads to more board stalls or boards where it's harder to attack. You have to find ways to do so. And overall, I think that cons is such a different experience that it doesn't surprise me that a lot of people don't like it. But I think there's so much to pull from that's masterful, like having so many different archetypes that are fun. I think that the morphs were really fun. I think that looking for ways to use underutilized cards is something you don't see as much of anymore, just because mostly all the cards are good and people know what the good ones are. Whereas in cons, part of the edge was like, can I make Valley Dasher good? That's the 2/2 haste for 2 that must attack, which is really bad unless you're in the right deck. Can I make Jeskai Student good, or Barrage of Boulders? These are all like aggressive red-white Jeskai style cards. Or can I make Rakshasa Secret and Delve cards good? I think Sultai was a little underpowered still, but there was definitely ways to make it work. And Cons has a lot more of that. Can I make this good instead of this card's good? I know this card's good, and I'm going to try to play more good cards than my opponent. Which, again, it isn't to say that modern limited sets don't have decision making. Obviously, I'm not saying that. I just think Cons has a lot different kinds of decision, and you have more time to enact those decisions. And so it rewards a lot more knowledge of both your opponent's deck and the format. And it leads to a lot fewer, I think, games that are just over very quickly because you stumbled. So I guess my take overall is this is less of a defense of Cons and more an explanation of Cons, because I think that there's a lot that we could take from Cons that would improve formats these days. And I'm curious if any of the folks making the cards have thought about that, because Cons is just like kind of in your face how different it is, versus some things which I either understand why people don't like, or some things that are legitimately bad about the format. I think it's not a shock that you could improve the format, if you used modern knowledge. So Cons is good. If you haven't tried it, I would suggest trying it. It is pretty cool. But if it's not your speed, there's nothing wrong with you, or if you don't like the format, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with Cons if the format's not to your liking either. This is just a very different world, and there's a reason a lot of people love it. There's a reason it's a beloved set, but some of those reasons I think are very different from how things work now, and might have been lost in translation. So very interesting format. It's not all like we're looking at it through rose-colored glasses. I'm now seeing like, oh, here's some of the faults, but I'm also seeing like, oh man, I really like this thing about this, and a lot of people now don't like it. That's kind of curious. That always makes me think,
Yeah.